Good almost evening, everyone. Welcome to the happy hour session of the Voices for Liberty Symposium today. This session is going to be a little different than the others that we've had all day. Our sessions from this morning and this afternoon were really centered on papers that the program is sponsoring. This session is going to be about a different part of our work, which is we are bringing this conversation about free speech and civil rights to various civil rights movements. My friends here and I had this conversation at another conference, the National Civil Rights Conference in June, I believe, in June. And it produced a lot of really good discussion, and so we want to keep having this conversation, and so we would love your participation at certain points. I have some questions for you, but first let me introduce our two friends. Eric Smith, on my right, your left, is Associate Professor of Rhetoric at York College of Pennsylvania. He has an eclectic scholarly set of interests, but his primary work focuses on the rhetorics of anti-racist activism, theory, and pedagogy. He is the co-founder or a co-founder of Free Black Thought, which is a website dedicated to highlighting viewpoint diversity within the Black intelligentsia. His recent writings include several op-eds, as well as his book, A Critique of Anti-Racism in Rhetoric and Composition, The Semblance of Empowerment, that was published in 2020. That title tells you a little bit about where Eric is coming from. He's also an advisor for both the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, as well as Counterweight, an organization that advocates for classical liberal concepts of social justice. Currently, he is a visiting scholar in politics and society for the Cato Institute. And on my left, your right, is John Wood Jr., who is National Ambassador for Braver Angels, America's largest grassroots bipartisan organization dedicated to the work of political depolarization. Their national network of volunteers and bipartisan local alliances create space for empathetic dialogue, constructive debate, and they're challenging politicians and institutions to build trust across the political divide. John and Braver Angels have been on all kinds of media. I will not read the whole list that they've been on. Notably, John is also an opinion columnist for USA Today, and he has a podcast called Uniting America, and he's also the host of a program called Reconstruction Project on KBLA 1580 in LA, which is the only Black-owned talk radio network station west of the Mississippi. So those are our two guests, and I am Debbie Gatte, the Initiative Director for Voices for Liberty, and one of your hosts for the day. So let's just jump into a conversation here. You'll see that we have a title for this, Shall we have free speech or uniform speech? And we're asking that question in the context of civil rights, within civil rights movements, and in particular, we are going to focus in on the American Black civil rights movement. Okay, so as we jump into this, let me ask all of you who have been listening to our papers and our scholars all day, how many of you believe dissent within a civil rights movement is important for progress? Okay, for our friends who are at home virtually or on C-SPAN, that was maybe a half to two-thirds hands that went up. How many people believe that individuals within a civil rights movement can fundamentally disagree yet pursue common goals? About the same number of shy sort of hands going up. Okay. All right. Well, let's talk about that. Let's find out. So I've got some questions, and we're gonna get into a conversation here. John and Eric know each other, and as I've said, we've had this an iteration of this conversation before. So I'm going to start with John, because you've studied the Black civil rights movement deeply, and this is something that you're very passionate about, and that a lot of your learning and your present work is rooted in studying that movement. So in terms of free speech and dissent within the movement, has anything changed from how things were in, say, the 1960s, which is probably what people think of when they think of the American civil rights movement? So what has changed, do you think?
Right. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me, Debbie. It's good to see you, Eric, and good to see everybody in the audience. Here, There are a lot of things that have changed from the 1960s to today. Fundamentally, of course, the sort of the center of the bullseye in terms of the target area for civil rights, civil liberties, really social justice reforms, and social justice might almost be a somewhat more useful word here in a certain sense, has shifted away from what, of course, was the explicit, the response to sort of the explicit de jure policies of racial segregation, racial exclusion, obviously the Jim Crow signage, segregated bathrooms, lunch counters, et cetera, that characterized so much of the face of racial discrimination in American society in the 1960s. That issue set does not really exist today, which is not to discount the idea that there's an issue set to be reckoned with. But the context is changed pretty dramatically in terms of what we are aiming our efforts against, or what people who would consider themselves to be social justice advocates find themselves aiming their efforts towards. There's a great emphasis today, of course, on equity. And what is the definition of equity? This is a question that is itself subject to some controversy, but a component of it is ensuring a representation of people of color within organizational spaces, within institutional spaces, and also in certain contexts to perhaps arrive at an equality of outcome. This is a definition of equity that many people, although not all people who ascribe importance to that term, subscribe to. And what does that amount to? Potentially equality in terms of income and benefits within a commercial institution, potentially equality in terms of proportional registration or attendance and enrollment at institutions of higher learning. And all of these things have a great deal of great many implications in terms of the operations of various institutions and organizations and the texture of our politics. But with respect to sort of the culture of these different movements, the sort of third wave anti-racist movement today, so to speak, and the movement that we think of when we think about the civil rights movement reflecting on the 1960s, there does tend to be a greater emphasis on a degree of uniformity, I would argue, within the modern social justice movement. It doesn't mean that there is not some diversity of perspective within the breadth of those forces in American politics and activism today. But there tends to be an insistence on a basic agreement surrounding the idea that we live in what is essentially a white supremacist construct in modern American society, that the institutions of our society are arrayed in such a way so as to reinforce the privilege and power and position of a white patriarchal majority within our institutions and in our politics broadly speaking. And much of the sort of forward momentum of that movement is led by people who are activists, but who find themselves oftentimes with pedigree in the academy, coming out of sort of narrower circles, I think, within the black community than was necessarily the case in the 1960s, when you had an older black middle class that ultimately found itself in common cause with a younger sort of student-led wing of the movement that incorporated people as philosophically diverse as A. Philip Randolph, as Roy Wilkins of the NAACP, who really pursued a legal strategy for the advancement of civil rights. Into that milieu came Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, pioneering the use of direct action as a means of advancing civil rights. That was not a mainstream tactic of the civil rights movement before the advent of Dr. King. And so there's a great deal of friction and competition between each of these different wings of the movement. But it was based on the idea that you needed an expansive philosophical and ethnic and political coalition in order to advance that cause. And I'm not quite sure that the status quo sort of mentality of third wave anti-racism is quite as philosophically inclusive, and it has its own tensions with the idea of sort of privileging the participation of certainly a number of white people at sort of the forefront of the movement in many respects. There's more tension around that subject as well. And so in all these ways, and probably a couple more, I think things have shifted a bit.
So what happens if you are not, if your views, you consider yourself to be part of the movement?
Pull this mic closer. I feel like I'm having to
Yes.
lean in too much. Yeah.
What happens if you consider yourself to be part of that movement, but you are not, your views are different from the status quo today?
Well, look, I mean, it's hard to have this conversation without invoking the phrase cancel culture. I mean, cancel culture is a little bit of a complicated issue, but one of the fundamental divides that you've seen arise around the conversation as it relates to civil liberties and social justice and civil rights is again sort of a breakdown along this question of, do we live in a society that reflects the basic assertions of critical race theory? Do we live in a society that is, on the one hand, a liberal society in which, fundamentally we have equality before the law, but we just need a more proactive government, for example, to sort of, give people access to more level playing field, right? Do we need to strengthen affirmative action programs and so forth to bring people into a position to sort of equitably compete for the American dream? Or do we live in a society that by its core sort of characteristics is by its very nature sort of arrayed against the interests of African Americans and other people of color? In theory, you could have a coalition of people who fall on either side of that question who still strive towards the basic end of trying to empower people of color and African Americans and other marginalized groups towards a place of prosperity and equality. But in practice, what oftentimes happens is if there's not some agreement on this basic diagnosis of the character of American society, I think one is oftentimes looked at as being a tool for the very sort of white supremacy that social justice activism sort of is aiming against. And so it becomes difficult to sustain a philosophically diverse coalition past a certain point, I think, if you stray beyond that perspective.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. So let's pick it up there, Eric. So I consider you to be a dissenting voice within the Black Civil Rights Movement. You probably consider yourself to be a dissenting voice. So John has just described how the Civil Rights Movement has shifted, not only in terms of goals, but in terms of the ability to have ideological diversity within the movement. What is your experience being as a dissenting voice within the movement, and have you experienced inclusion and acceptance, or have you experienced something else?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't say that I'm a dissenting voice within the civil rights movement, because I wouldn't call what's going on today civil rights. I would call it, well, there are a lot of things I would call it that isn't safe for television. So I'll just call it the nerdiest thing I could possibly call it, critical social justice. What is critical social justice? Well, it is, you will hear people talking about cultural Marxism and things like that. Well, it has a Marxist framework, perhaps, but it's not Marxism proper. Instead of bourgeois proletariat, right, we have white, non-white, or able, disabled, or something, right? Some kind of hegemonic group versus some non-hegemonic group. And everything in society is built to maintain and maintain the comfort of that hegemonic group, right? So whenever, for example, whenever a black person is talking to a white person, according to critical social justice, something racist is going on in that conversation. We just haven't found it yet. One of the tenets of critical social justice is the question is not did racism happen, but how did it manifest in that situation? Which is to say that it's always already going on. No need to think critically. It's already there. The narrative of critical social justice is thinking for you, right? So yes, I am a dissenting voice as far as that is concerned. And well, how has it affected me? Well, I'm no longer in academia. So I resigned a couple of months ago. I got to update that.
Yes, I need to update the bio.
I resigned a couple of months ago, reluctantly, because as a dissenting voice and one of the only ones, I wanted to stick around and make sure that voice was heard. But then I realized that I can do more outside of academia to change things than within academia. So my viewpoint has been shunned to a large degree because it is more in line with the viewpoint of traditional 1960s civil rights than it is today. I am a big fan of classical liberal values, right? Not just free speech, but individuality, the primacy of reason, right? All kinds of different things, spontaneous order, private property, obviously, all these different things I abide by. And if you listen to a lot of the civil rights movement, now John, I'm not as steeped in this as you are, but if you listen to a lot of it, it sounds like they're not shunning classical liberal values. They want to be included in those values. They want to also enjoy those values. Today, those very values are seen as quote unquote white ways of knowing by a lot of contemporary activists who are steeped in the critical social justice ideology and not the social justice ideology, right? So that aversion to classical liberal values is what I take the biggest issue with. Now, things are changing. There seems to be a ebb, I guess. The pendulum is swinging back, all kinds of different metaphors you can use for this. But it's not gone away completely. And I think the mistake we made before was to think that we all agree that classical liberalism is a great thing. We all agree that free speech is a good thing at all times, right? We all agree that individuality is the primary disposition and not membership in a group or something like that. We assumed incorrectly. There are a lot of people who did not feel that way and were underground, as Greg Lukianoff would say, planning until, the kairotic moment arrived, and it did within the last decade. We can't do that again. We have to explicitly talk about these values. We have to explicitly talk about free speech and why we have it, individuality and why we have it. Classical liberal values did not just pop up. They popped up as a response to religious wars. People were trying to say, okay, how can we not kill each other? Maybe we can talk. How about talking? Civil discourse, right? We have reasons for these values. We need to emphasize those reasons and explicitly talk about those values and not assume that everybody just knows them and appreciates them. I'll stop there.
Okay, so Eric has just described, John, his views, his experience being shunned, and the consequences to him personally. At the same time, he's described a pendulum swinging and maybe shifting back, and some of the lessons we want to learn as we are shifting back towards more classical liberal values. To me, there's some connection here between dissent, the role of dissent, and improving the direction of civil rights movement. So from your perspective, what is the role of dissent within a civil rights movement? When is it productive? When is it counterproductive? Because a movement is trying to go somewhere.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think any movement is enriched and empowered by disagreement, so long as it stops short of being fundamental disagreement. That was sort of the nuance in your language earlier, I think, that is worth highlighting a little bit. Ultimately, the civil rights movement of the 1960s was dynamic both philosophically and methodologically. I sometimes try and remind people that Dr. King and of course besides him, Bayard Rustin and Septima Clark and the other veterans and leaders of that wing of the movement really led a movement within a movement. The nonviolent movement was a movement within the civil rights movement, essentially, that operated according to a certain philosophy and a certain sort of strategic disposition in interaction with other parties and other players. I mean, as I mentioned a little bit before, Roy Wilkins, the NAACP, which was really the premier organization advancing the interest of African Americans and fighting for the legal rights of Black people in America. Their methodology was legal engagement. They thought that the civil rights movement was something to be fought through in the courts. And Dr. King's methods of direct action, protest, activism, boycott, was really kind of looked at, frowned upon a little bit until it began to sort of produce results. Dr. King's expansive vision of social integration as being a positive aim of the civil rights movement was not something that was universally sort of accepted or emphasized, and so while the tension between the approach of the SCLC and the NAACP was sort of generative, that disagreement over whether or not we really want to be integrating with white folks in any meaningful sort of way set the stage for a more fundamental disagreement between Dr. King and the leadership that would eventually take over with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the person of Stokely Carmichael and others, who, although SNCC, the Southern Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, had a deep history of collaboration with the SCLC, it was sort of nurtured in its early stages through leadership of students who participated in the Greensboro sit-ins and other direct student engagements. But ultimately, the leadership of SNCC and a lot of the young people in the movement found themselves more and more inspired by individuals like Malcolm X. And Malcolm X, who's somebody who I admire greatly, but who I hesitate to sort of refer to as being a part of the civil rights movement per se, because Malcolm was not necessarily looking for the sort of desegregating policy reforms that Dr. King and others were looking for. What Malcolm was looking for was a psychologically empowered Black population that would have autonomy and sovereignty even on its own land within the United States of America. Not a practical program, in the opinion of Baird Rustin and others, but nevertheless, Malcolm X could have cared less about eating next to white people and so forth. That influence on Stokely Carmichael set the stage for the rise of the Black power consciousness in the civil rights movement, which essentially said that we are here to empower Black people against the vicious and violent forces of white supremacy in our society. And the language of loving your enemies, that was the rhetoric of Martin Luther King Jr., is an obstacle towards is an obstacle in the face of that goal. And so there was a great effort to sort of keep that coalition together, to keep the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee working alongside the SCLC, to keep the Black ministers and the attorneys on the same page as the student activists. But ultimately, this difference of opinion as to how much should we be emphasizing sort of, this vision of multiracial sort of democracy, right? As opposed to the strident opposition against racism. This set the stage for a pretty fundamental divide. And part of what's interesting, to my view, is the fact that on the one hand, of course, King died in 1968, and by that point in time, the sort of militant wing of the movement had grown stronger. The iconography, the hagiography, if you will, the halo around Dr. King's legacy has shined brighter and brighter. But in terms of not all, but a significant amount of the actual substantive influence that has descended to subsequent generations of activists in American social justice. So much of the substance of that is drawn from sort of the Black power consciousness, is drawn from kind of the Stokely Carmichael vision of advocacy on behalf of African Americans. There are other influences, and Eric, you mentioned sort of, the kind of Marxist sort of flavor of critical race theory, and so there's an academic, there's an ideological touch point there as well that we could talk about. But that division within the civil rights movement is something that is not fully reconciled even at this moment. I'll just leave you with this little anecdote. I am sort of the token moderate conservative on a very progressive black radio network. And I have my points of sympathy, honestly, with people who have a more critical kind of outlook, critical theory, race theory kind of outlook on American society, because I think that for historical reasons, there are ways in which, I would argue the education system, the healthcare system, the private economy, and housing and all sorts of other categorical areas of American life are structurally evolved in a way that tends to reinforce the material inequality of black people vis-a-vis other groups in American society. I don't necessarily think that is mostly a contemporaneously conscious sort of decision on the part of anybody, but systematically, if you want to define systematic racism in those sorts of terms, I think that there's a definite argument to be made for it. So I can converse with people who think in those terms. But after Donald Trump won the election the other night, one of the very first things that my colleague, very progressive activist in Los Angeles, said on air to the people listening was, if it turns out that a majority of white women just gave the election to Donald Trump, we're never going to forgive white women as black women in America. And that comment, it was coming from a place of pain and frustration, but it was, to my mind, sad and hurtful and counterproductive in multiple ways. One, you don't just want to blanketly judge groups of people that you don't know, but two, it's sort of like a lot of activists have forgotten the nature of politics to begin with. Politics only works if you can create a coalition large enough and diverse enough to actually shift not just the balance of power, but ideally the way people think in a large-scale society. And if you are predicating your activism on a premise of cutting people out of your coalition, then you've just articulated a recipe for political self-destruction. And so, this confusion is something that you can kind of trace all the way back in some respect to this never quite reconciled difference of philosophical opinion between Martin Luther King Jr. and Stokely Carmichael and the forces and factions they represented.
Thank you. Okay, so John, you described setting out with a set of goals for a movement, discovering your goals are actually not aligned, starting to have the tension between factions within the movement. Some points the tension breaks and there's a certain part of what considered to be one thing no longer is part of it. There's still tension within the remaining sections of it. We have had this division, that tension snapped, and we're still living the downstream effects of that. So, Eric, my question for you is, before it snaps, right? What are the conditions within a movement that allow for dissent? So, when can dissent occur? When can it be productive? What are the conditions within a movement that make it possible? Because you experience a snap, so you're out, right? So, what would be the productive conditions?
Well, first and foremost, we have to be on the same page about several different categories. There's already a term for this in rhetorical theory called stasis theory. And basically what it does is make sure that we are in agreement on at least these things. Can we agree on the facts? All right. If we can't agree on the facts, the conversation has to be about the facts. If we can agree about the facts, how are we defining the terms? If we can't agree on the definition of terms, that's what the conversation has to be. And what I've seen in the past few years is a lot of people talking past each other because they have different definitions of the same terms, and they don't realize it. right? So if they would have stopped beforehand and said, okay, let's make sure we're on the same page regarding these terms, then perhaps they could have had a generative conversation. Next is the quality of the situation. Is this a big deal? You know, if we do have the facts straight and the definitions straight, then is the problem something we need to worry about? Is it a small deal? Is it something we can push aside right now? And then finally, what do we do about it? So what do we do about it is really that's what everybody's trying to get to. You get these, you do these steps in order to get to what do we do about it? We're not doing these steps. So I would like to see stasis theory implemented and normalized, not just in academia, not just in activist movements, but civilly, you know, in civil discourse. Let's make sure we're on the same page about these things before we get into a disagreement, right? So that the disagreement can be legitimate, right? It can be an actual disagreement of actual facts, shared definitions, and things like that. That's what I would like to see first and foremost. And that doesn't mean that everything's going to be okay, that we're all going to get along after each mode of stasis is taken care of. But it's a necessary beginning, right? I will say this, though. I think other than sharing facts and terms and qualifications and things like that, we also have to share teloi, right? We have to have the same aims, or at least comparable aims, right? The distinction between traditional civil rights and what we see today, what I've been calling critical social justice, is that traditional civil rights was about empowering Black people. Contemporary civil rights, quote unquote, is about disempowering white people, right? Those are two different things. They can seem the same in certain contexts, but they're two very different things. And I'm all for the former and not at all for the latter. I think the latter is a result of critical social justice and its corresponding narrative, right? Which says it's always racism. The answer is always racial animus. There's a problem with racism. I was late for work, racism. Right? My stomach hurts, racism. You know, everything's racism. And I think that's a lack of critical thinking, right? It is a overabundance of critical social justice thinking, and I think that's the issue. I'll stop there.
So, John,
Yes.
Eric's views are clear, right?
Eric is
Are
always
they?
clear.
Eric's views are clear. They're clear. Eric's views are clear.
Never any ambiguity.
I understand them. Where within today's civil rights activist movements is there room for somebody like Eric to actually influence the direction of a movement, right? So you described your colleague at the radio station and what she said on air, which sounds like a very closing the door kind of response. Where are you optimistic that views such as Eric's could have an influence on the direction of?
Well, you know, I think that Eric is a compelling voice both
Mind that we
for
talk about you while you're sitting
right,
right
here.
here.
Let's make this all about Eric Smith here. Eric is a compelling advocate for the liberal fundamentals, and I think that in a moment in time where people have lost faith in the idea that persuasion, that dialogue, that straightforward civic engagement on the basis of the merit of ideas with people who do not see things the way you do, politically, culturally, or philosophically, can move the needle in the direction of progress. I would like to believe that a voice like Eric's can help reacquaint folks with the power of those fundamentals. Tavis Smiley owns the radio network for which I have a show in Los Angeles, and Tavis is, many folks will be familiar with him, of course. And Tavis is an unapologetically progressive individual who also, if you know him, is somebody who is willing to converse and dialogue and debate in good faith with people from across sort of the widest, the wider, at least, spectrum of perspectives on the subject of civil rights and social justice and others. And I think my only frustration with Tavis is that he's not quite as adamant as Eric that other people follow that way of doing things, but he embodies it, right? And so I think in a moment where there is inevitably reflection and soul searching taking place within the black community and within sort of social justice oriented circles following the victory of Donald Trump. Maybe this is a moment in time where somebody looks up and says, maybe we should have listened to Eric Smith a little bit more about some of what was going on. But yeah, I mean, I do want to make this well, I do want to make one point though, because we've been talking here in terms of civil rights movement, right? In reality, the phrase civil rights, while it certainly can apply or be made to apply to, we could talk about questions of speech and reproductive rights and so forth, and in African American context. I mean, we can talk about affirmative action and a number of other points of policy. But I think that if you look at the issue set, there's a strong argument to be made, and it was largely believed at the time, even in the 1960s, that the major issues with respect to civil rights, the major battles, had already been won with the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. What was left undone was winning the battle for economic justice in American life. And truth be told, there were always two parts of the civil rights agenda, one focused on civil rights and the other focused on economic equality and economic progress. And the component of it focused on economic issues was always sort of minimized in favor of the more politically palatable emphasis on civil rights. And so the I Have a Dream speech was given in the 1963 March on Washington, which was called the March for Jobs and Freedom. And when Dr. King died in 1968, of course, he died while conceptualizing a poor people's campaign that, by the way, was meant to bring together poor black and white people on a class basis to advocate for greater economic equality and greater economic opportunity in American life. And a lot of the pushback that was coming to King and other mainstream leaders of the civil rights movement was coming to them on the basis of the idea that they weren't doing enough for economic progress, even though King always wanted to sort of be focused there, because the gains of civil rights, the ability to suddenly be able to vote without intimidation in the rural South, the desegregation of the Jim Crow South, these were gains most explicitly accrued to black Southerners who, for the first time in American history, were now no longer even a majority of the larger African American population. By the time of King's death, most black Americans who had historically lived in the South were now living in major urban centers across the country, where the abolition of Jim Crow had no real impact on their day-to-day life, their day-to-day quality of life. The most difficult, what might have been the most difficult chapter of Dr. King's activism took place in a moment of time that is little sort of reflected upon today. His activism in Chicago, his attempt to expand the work of the SCLC to challenge the Daley machine, the machine of Richard Daley in Chicago, where they took on the real estate interests, where they sought to take on not just redlining, but crime, labor unions, and discovered a viciousness of hostility directed towards them by people who lived in this major urban community. Dr. King led a march that took him underneath the glaring sort of overview of high-rise residential buildings where people by the dozens and the hundreds threw bottles and stones from on high, raining down on the marchers. And it was something like they had never seen in Selma or Montgomery. But I just say all that to say that part of the difficulty here is we want to apply a civil rights frame, but again, the issue set is different. The economic questions are still largely in play, I would argue. In the aftermath of the civil rights movement, you had a wing of the black community that integrated into the middle class, and a wing of the black community that fell into mass incarceration and the degradation of American urban centers. There's a dramatic difference of circumstances, between these two groups, but what has remained consistent is this idea that the economic fight has not yet been won. The thing that's applicable from that time to now, though, and this is just back to Eric's point, I believe, is the idea that whatever the issue set, we have to believe that we can make progress on it if we are able to build a diverse and dynamic coalition of people of all colors and as much philosophical breadth and diversity as is practically possible, who in good conscience are aimed towards moving American society closer towards the realization of its promise, that this be a land of opportunity for all people. And so that has to be our philosophical and social and cultural approach. And I think that the way Martin Luther King Jr. and the nonviolent movement exemplified and articulated that value set still has great application to us today. It's deeply resonant with the liberal fundamentals that Eric articulated, but what comes on top of that is this, in many respects, Christian idea of loving your neighbor as you love yourself. This principle of agape love that was aimed at moving the conscience of the opposition and the surrounding society and so forth, and so, I think speech employed with that sort of spirit represented the cultural and moral power of Dr. King's movement, the nonviolent movement. And I would like to believe that it could still be that way today.
Okay. Thank you, John. So I have two questions for Eric. One, because I don't want to leave this open implication on the table here. So Eric, I'm going to ask you, do you believe is there racism in America? That's one question for you. And then tell us about free black thought and what you want to accomplish through that.
Okay, so your first question, the answer is yes. The second question.
Right.
Well, yes, of course there's racism in America, and to an extent it is systemic in certain places. But is it something that is insurmountable? No. I know people who will plan a 10-block parade because somebody called them the N-word in traffic. When somebody calls me the N-word in traffic, I'm like, there's something wrong with that guy. Clearly I'm not the N-word, weirdo. So there are different ways of dealing with this racism. It's not something that is blocking black people or non-white people generally from a happy and fulfilling life. That is my opinion on that. Free Black Thought is a nonprofit put together to highlight viewpoint diversity within Black America. I don't even like saying Black America because that sounds monolithic, right? But that's not the case. 40 million Black people, 40 million different ways to be Black, right? You wouldn't know that from mainstream media, which gives you a certain disposition of Blackness, one that is militant to some degree, right? One that is lacking agency, in a lot of ways, right? We need other people's help to do things that everybody else can do pretty easily, right? Things like that is what you will see in the mainstream media. So we are the non-mainstream media, and we platform voices that are not reflective of the media's representation of Black people. So we have a journal, we have a podcast, we're working on K through 12 curricula, so we'll see how that goes. And I hope people can find us on the web, on Twitter, and see what we're about and realize that, Black people are individuals too. We're not the Borg.
Thank you. And, I just, for the audience, the two questions I asked at the beginning, just to circle back with you, when we asked the same two questions in June at the National Civil Rights Conference, we had many more hands up on both of them. So that's just an interesting observation for the three of us to maybe take away and talk about a little bit. This is interesting that we had a different reaction in the room here today. But I want to thank both Eric for being honest, open, and having the courage to share his views in spite of the pressure not to. And to thank John for his deep and very benevolent view about how we think through these issues and where we can go together from here. So I'm always super encouraged after I talk to the two of you that we have a bright future here. And so with that, our symposium is concluded for the day. Yes. We will be sharing the papers that we discussed throughout the day. As you saw, the authors were getting feedback that will ultimately help them write the best final draft that they can, and these are going to be published in academic journals, etc. So we're going to share those papers with everybody. If you're on the list for the registration today, you will get emails and information from us. We also have a website that has all the videos from our past events. So if you're curious about what the conversation has looked like with students across the country, we have videos of some of those events on our website. So do check them out. And we're going to be continuing this conversation because yes, we value free speech. Yes, we have free speech protections, but we haven't answered all of the questions when it comes to applying the principles around free speech. And every time we talk with the students, they challenge us on questions that they would like answered that we don't yet have answers to. So we're hoping this new cadre and cohort of people who are writing papers, people who are doing new scholarship, that they're going to take up some of the questions. The students that are coming to campus and engaging with our speakers are going to be tomorrow's advocates for free speech and civil rights, and that we will keep using our voices and our pens to make social progress possible. So thank you for joining us, and let's go celebrate the day with the reception. Okay.